All right, welcome back, everyone, to the third panel of the symposium on political dimensions of code art and software production. And I think if it helps you, you can substitute ethical, or you can substitute justice, or other more and less problematic words as you like. The panel brings together a group of researchers involved in distinctive cultures of computational production around political, ethical, justice issues. I think in various ways, all of the panelists are conducting interventions in how network culture is made, conducting and performing interventions in particular in the technologies that make network culture, communication, and governance. A common point of reference, give or take, I think, and in different ways for our panelists, is the longish history of free and open source software, a history that entangles much of the past few decades of computational art with the programming languages, software environments, and so forth that have underpinned the everyday construction and provision of the internet. The panel will take the form of a series of short presentations by each of the panelists. They'll introduce themselves before each part, and then we'll have some time, about 20-25 minutes at the end, for general discussion among the panelists and with the floor. But I will briefly tell you who is who. So immediately on my right is Luis Navarro de Angel, followed by Ramsey Nasser, Parrish Schlesinger, Alejandro Tamayo, and Allison Parrish. And without further ado, I will hand the projector over to Luis.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Luis. I'm a PhD student here at McMaster in Communication, New Media, and Cultural Studies program. And I'm working with, my research project deals with live coding, music, which is the performance art of typing code in front of an audience in order to generate expressive materials such as music, in my case, but also other types of materials such as video and images. And so today, I'm going to talk about the possibility of live coding as a performance art to be part also of this economic development, part of the economic development project. So during the 1977 History of Programming Languages conference held in LA in USA, Admiral Grace Hopper here in the screen made an account of the history of the very first programming languages. In very simple terms, she mentioned programming languages developed during the early 1950s intended to automate low-level subroutines in order to reduce physical laborious chores of the programmer, often a woman and a mathematician. So she also mentions that during the mid-1950s, computer programming took a clerical orientation focused on another type of programmer, one dealing with data processing. This new programmer was business trained and often lacked mathematical knowledge to code. A team led by her sat down to examine this jargon that people doing data processing were talking, and so they came up with a list of 30 verbs. This list developed in a new computer notation based in English statements. This new language made possible to generate programs in English, but also in other languages derived from German and French. And that's what actually Grace Hopper did and her team. They developed two programs, one in German and one in French, as a sort of proof of concept. And so Hopper mentions during this keynote that after doing this, after rendering these programs in German and French, she and her team had to spend 4 months apologizing for programming in languages other than English. And as for the Radio Corporation of America's directors, with which she was collaborating with, and I quote, "It was absolutely obvious that a respectable American computer built in Philadelphia could not possibly understand French and German." So the important part from this anecdote that Hopper recounts is that she's highlighting that although these programs were just a simple translation from mathematical code, or mathematical language. From a managerial perspective, this translation was dangerous as it was introducing a whole set of foreign languages. So programming languages based on natural languages other than English exist nowadays. An example is this one here on the screen, which is called Latino. This is an open source programming language created in C that works with Spanish statements. This language was made with the intention for Spanish speakers to get access to understanding the computer's code. Here, I want to emphasize the idea of the computer's code as one type of code rather than a set of them. So languages such as Latino promote inclusivity and diversity in computation, but also seem to carry a narrow criticality on how this intention will potentially lead to perpetuating dominant modes of thinking. The Youth Mobile Initiative is another example, which aims to empowering youth with the skills and confidence to develop mobile apps for sustainable development. Here, sustainable development should be understood as economic growth. So Youth Mobile initiative was deployed by UNESCO in 2014 in African and Latin American countries in partnership with the MIT, Technovation, which is a non-profit organization that teaches technology skills to girls, and Apps for Good, which is a non-profit that teaches product development to the youth. Youth Mobile also targets rural and indigenous communities. A core goal of this project is to provide an entry point to entrepreneurship in the information and communication technologies industry. Some problematics I see that arise from this initiative are described as follows. So first, UNESCO's emphasis on subcontracting MIT enables the direct import of the university's liberal and entrepreneurial values. Secondly, because this initiative uses as a teaching resource software mostly available in European languages, it helps to reinforce the linguistic and scientific dominance already existent in the target countries. Conceptualizing code as one type of language, as I was saying, seems to have permeated more critical approaches as well. Examples of this include the field of critical code studies, where, for example, the digital scholar Mark Marino refers to code as a sign system with its own rhetoric. That is, a type of communication that possesses significance in excess of its functionality. In order to expand this definition, I argue that code is not a single communication system, but multiple ones, and furthermore, ones that are grounded on specific historical moments and modes of thinking. Systems that have become pervasively popular and furthermore official. These systems of communication I am talking about is the ones that I'm currently investigating on my PhD, which is called Exploring Culturally Situated Platforms for Live Coding Music. And so this, what I'm trying to study is the connection of how these dominant forms of conceptualizing awareness, modularity, historical orientation, immediacy, democratization, non-destructive editing and completion works in connection to programming languages and the arts. These dominant understandings, which are here on the screen, at the same time are rooted on preset directives derived from the discourse of modernization, or better said, the discourse of development, which is a thread from a knitting pattern where other discourses such as progress, industrialization, and more recently global governance intersect. Although the project of development is perceived to have failed and have decayed during the 1980s, it has not disappeared at all. But according to the development scholar Ramsey, it has reorganized and reshaped into the globalization discourse, where knowledge concerning North-South relations continues within international organizations and universities. This continuation is noticeable in the policy-making process, particularly the one connected to the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, which remark, and I quote, the need for development aid, but now obtained through neoliberal means. So, because this panel is about arts, and that's how my research, at the end, the result should be connected to arts. I'm going to now talk about the arts. And so current artistic practices are thought to have a potential for resisting these dominant modes I am talking about, these dominant modes of communication, or better said, ideologies. So this potential comes from a perceived consensus of the arts, current arts, to be outside of the rationalizing intentions of national and international development. Music, which is what I am particularly investigating, nevertheless, has shown to be both very rational and rationalizer. And so an example of that is the electrical engineer Max Matthews, here on the screen, which in 1963 was working at Bell Laboratories, and who exposed the idea of music making with the computer. Similarly to Admiral Hopper, who I was talking about at the beginning of my talk, one of Matthews' rationales for exploring computer-made music was the avoidance of manual dexterity. This rationale, which involves the removal of values of both the developer and the user, is one of the first developed or resulted in one of the first sound-oriented computer languages, actually called music. And by the 1970s, music, these programming languages, had multiple versions and was involved in projects dealing with automation, control, and disembodiment of the performer. And so live coding, again, the performance art of typing code in front of an audience in order to generate expressive material such as video and music, is recognized within the Imagine community of computer music. And so in that sense, live coding also connects to automation and abstraction in idiosyncratic ways in order to achieve real-time performances. Nonetheless, live coding alignment to music democratization is said to be less connected to capitalist entrepreneurialism. And this is said because live coding promotes, or the community around live coding promotes, improvisation and ephemeral constructions of software whose main purpose is just to function during the performance, and then they are erased after the performance has finished. But also that embraces the opening, and also embraces the opening of this black box that we call the computer. And so all these traits have made possible to start resisting, or to start thinking that we resist dominant ideologies within programming, electronic music making, and performance. And so here on the screen, this is my collective, in which Jessica also is part from. And so we are performing. This is how a live coding session might look like. And so all these critiques to capitalism, entrepreneurial ways of building software are facilitated through workshops by the live coding community. And so my argument here is that these workshops have a clear connection to national and international development projects. And in that sense, it posits live coding as a direct participant in the information and communication technologies for development, ICT4D, which is actually a field of study and a practice. Practice whose goal is to address global structural problems through technocratic means. As a final case study tied to live coding, to computer music, and to development, I want to talk about Sonic Pi, which is this programming language and interface that is here on the screen, which was developed as part as a sub-project by the Raspberry Pi Foundation, which is a UK-based educational charity best known for the creation of the Raspberry Pi computer. So, and this is a quote from a paper from the developers. So they say that the opportunity to develop Sonic Pi arose from the activities of this foundation being in the front of education change in the UK, having an explicit concern for broader access to technically oriented tools for hacking and making. And so Sonic Pi, furthermore, embraces the potential of live coding as a form of professional development and pedagogic innovation. While the latter the professional development and pedagogic innovation could potentially be true and beneficial. On the other hand, Sonic Pi main components, that is the programming language itself and the synthesizers, and so these languages for making music. So the language and the synthesizers are not localized, and yet are uncritically exported to countries outside the UK by members of the live coding community whose social position might coincidentally also be an elementary school teacher like I used to be. And so to finish my presentation, I would like to pose some further questions arising from this reflection. So how can we move from the diversity concept as a managerial concept to an equitable one? So how can we shift thinking diversity in terms of management to thinking in terms of equity, yeah, within software particularly. What are the limits of deconstructing ideologies of development within software? What are the benefits and dangers of integrating live coding and the arts in general to projects of economic development? How does looking at the natural languages, programming languages are derived from, uncover other power structures embedded in software? This brief letter. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Luis. And our next panelist is Ramsey Nasser.
That is actually correct. You're of Linux on the desktop. Cool, works. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be a part of this. My name is Ramsey Nasser. I'm a computer scientist, an artist, an educator, hacker, and I've been doing research for a couple of years around the cultural assumptions that are baked into computing and to programming languages in particular. I want to talk about that a little bit today, but today I'm going to be mostly talking about text and like dealing with text on computers and what that means. This is me last year. Live coding is also a very big part of my practice. This is me performing at a bar called Sunnyvale in Brooklyn using a tool that I made that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. I do mostly like live coded visuals. You can see this sort of in the text window and like a bunch of retro graphics on the side. So I love making art with computers. It's like actually the only thing that I want to do. I remember when I was studying computer science, and one of our teachers told us that the arc of our careers was such that you would get okay at programming and then would be promoted to managers and we'd never have to write code again. So like, don't worry about it. And everyone like breathed a sigh of relief, and I was just paralyzed with fear. All I want to do is program a computer and make art with it. And I do a lot of teaching as well because I want to share the expressivity that I feel in computers with other people. But there's a tension there, right, between how expressive I feel doing computer art and the fact of like what computers are today, right? Computer history is like very complicated, and like what a computer is there's all kinds of computers, but in general, the software stack that we've inherited has been primarily built by and for the English speakers of the English language, right? Linux, Mac OS are Unix-based operating systems written in C. Windows is its own thing that's also written in C++. The English language is really the first and maybe the only sort of citizen in this world, and everything else is quite literally an afterthought. So in addition to like being passionate about computer art and teaching computer art, It's important to look back past the techno-optimism of the way this stuff gets talked about. The one laptop per child is a project in particular that I return to a lot because I have very mixed feelings about it, right? Their website is a little much. They have a bunch of these like breathless photos of brown people like using their computers happily. These are a bunch of school children in Gaza. And on one hand, it is exciting to me to see like kids with computers, like kids learning code, and like maybe they'll find the same, resonance in programming that I did when I was growing up, just north of occupied Palestine in Beirut. But then if you dig through their website a little bit and you start to ask like what is actually on these computers, these are Linux computers, right? Programmed in Python. And they even say on their website that one of their apps is this thing called Pippy, and Pippy is a simple and fun introduction to programming in Python, the dynamic programming language underlying much of the software on the laptop. So these kids who are getting this laptop are confronted with this entirely English-based programming experience, right? And this isn't laptop.org's, the OLPC project's fault. This is the sort of like reality pervasive in computing, and I think this gets sort of lost in the like techno-optimism that talks of like how the democratizing potential of computing. So what I want to sort of look at is this question. This is something that I've kind of struggled with as a digital artist and as an educator for a little while. How do we ethically make, use, and teach creative tools on a platform that privileges one written culture above all else? I don't have any hard, easy answers here, but this is kind of the space that I'm trying to explore. So this investigation kind of started in 2012 for me while I was a fellow at an arts organization in New York called IBEAM. I was coming from the open source sort of processing world of like building teachable programming languages, building more intuitive programming languages. And this thought that I had when I was studying computer science in Beirut sort of bubbled back up to my head that, isn't it peculiar that every programming language I've ever been confronted with has been Latin text and English words. So to sort of like tease that out and explore that a bit, I designed my own programming language called Elb, which you see on the slide. It's a Lisp where the syntax is entirely in my own native language, which is Arabic. Just to get a sense of like what breaks when you deviate from the like Anglo-centric norm. And the short answer is almost everything, right? It's like everything goes to hell. That's not something that I have, in the short time that I have, a whole lot of space to explore. But I'm happy to like talk about it afterwards if that's interesting. The conclusion that I reached is that I was trying to pursue a programming experience that was entirely free of English, right? Like down to the metal, if possible. Like what could we put on a one laptop per child computer and send to Gaza such that no matter how many layers they pulled apart, they would only be confronted with their own language. I don't actually think that that's possible, right? Which is a bit of a downer. But what it comes down to is names. And a lot of the focus of Elb in that sort of phase of my research was around character encodings and the fact that a lot of programming languages won't let you write text that is not Latin. And like, how do we get around that? And the whole point of Elb is to sort of make a programming language where the only characters you're allowed to write were in my own language. In fact, more modern programming languages have relaxed the restrictions. So in Swift, you can have actually like Arabic function names and variable names. That's totally allowed. But that doesn't actually solve the problem. The problem is names. And the way names, what I mean by names is the fact that software is only ever built by building on other software. I think maybe the last time a human being wrote a program from scratch, actually from scratch, may have been in the mid-50s, if then, right? So you're always building on someone else's software, right? If I'm making a website, I'm building on JavaScript frameworks, right? So this is a snippet of 3JS, which is a library in JavaScript that allows you to do 3D graphics in the browser. And by using someone else's code, I'm actually required to use the exact names that they assigned to their functions and procedures with no deviations allowed. So in this snippet, geometry, material, and cube, those are names that I'm supplying in my program. But box geometry, mesh, basic material, mesh, these are all names coming out of someone else's code that I'm building on top of. I have to use these exact names, and these are English language names, right? So when you combine the facts that software is always built on other software, and other software has historically always been written in English, even if you had some kind of culturally neutral programming experience that was perfect and made everyone happy, and such a thing I've never even seen described, you would have to rewrite the last 60 years of all software, right? The other example here that I give is even beyond programming languages. This is a bunch of headers from an HTTP exchange. So this is a web browser making a request to a web server to download a web page. And you have words like host, accept encoding, keep alive. These are in the actual binary packet that goes over the wire to make the request for the web page. If you use other words, the server is just going to ignore your request because it's wrong. So English names are actually baked into the stack all the way down, almost down to the middle. This is something that I write about somewhat at length in an essay that I published in a journal last year, in the journal called Decolonizing Digital, I believe. I hope I'm not getting it wrong. But if you do a Google search for this with my name, in quotes with my name, that'll come up. But like I said, the story of like non-English programming is kind of bleak, outside of interesting experiments and self-contained projects. So that's not actually what I want to focus on today. To the point of the dean made earlier today, and I'm very happy that he did this. I've been looking for more actionable, a more actionable direction, something where I can start to answer the question of like what is to be done. And a related problem is the way text is consumed and displayed on computers, particularly with on platforms with a creative bend. And the question to sort of keep in the back of your minds here is like, what do we mean when we say text? That's a word that gets thrown around in computing a lot. So this is a screenshot from the reference page of the P5JS framework, which is a framework for creative coding that is used to like introduce a lot of people to programming. It does graphics and it's very nice and it runs in the browser. This is a screenshot from their function that renders text, right? So this is a modification that I made last night on the latest cut of P5. I replaced the string literal word with a string literal for the Arabic word kalima, which is the word for word. Because when I hear text, that word means to me human writing, right? So it is a completely reasonable assumption that this would work, right? And it doesn't actually come close. So what you're seeing here is something that's going to come up a lot in this talk. These are the correct letters for the Arabic word kalima, but they are typeset left to right, so backwards, and they're not joined together. Arabic is a cursive language, right? It's really important to stress that this isn't like close. This may as well be chicken scratch. This is not legible, right? Processing does not issue a warning. You don't get any kind of notification. You just get a butchered language. This is not a dunk on processing either. Just like the bringing up one laptop per child is not a dunk on them either. This is pervasive. I just bring them up as an example because this is a very easy, very immediate thing to demonstrate what I'm talking about. But this is what I want to focus on because this is everywhere, as we'll see in a bit. And I think we could do something about this, right? So that's the first thing that interests me in this problem. Is it strikes me as addressable in a way that, looking at programming, I feel like the best that I can do is like make people aware of this like crushing hegemony. So it's addressable, but it's also it's a really big deal. Seeing your language represented like this consistently in media, in computing, in your own tools, in other people's tools, there's a kind of violence to seeing this. And it just sort of becomes part of this like larger murmur of alienation that you feel as an Arabic person in the war, right? When I see this, I think about the Muslim ban, and I think about all the other terrible things that this that come with being an AI person in 2019. So it's serious and addressable. So that's like an exciting, I'm an engineer at heart, right? So it's an exciting like thing to take on. So what do we do, right? So what is to be done, to use the Dean's phrasing? And I do actually have some things that I think are the right way to go. And I want to address three groups of people in this analysis. There are people who make tools for computer art. There are people who use tools for computer art. And there are people who teach how to do either one of those, right? And I want to get to them in turn. So if you're a tool maker, so there's a trickiness here, right? Some people make tools for themselves and only for themselves, and that's perfectly legitimate, I think. Some people make tools for a small group of people, and they're able to address their immediate needs, and I think that's perfectly legitimate. But some people make tools that they intend others to use. Some people make tools as a product, right? Some people make tools that they teach in their classes. Some people make tools for themselves that then end up getting adopted by a big group of people, right, in open source. And if it's the case that you intend or you find yourself in a situation where you're maintaining or developing a tool that people beyond yourself are using, I don't know I don't know what a nice way to say this is, but you just need to do your job. You actually have to get it right. It's unacceptable to have this stuff out in the world as broken as it is. I think a lot of it is a mindset, right? People sort of approach non-Latin text as a feature, right? It's like, we'll make it work for English, and then we'll get to the squiggly languages. Which means that that sort of technical inclusion is not actually in the DNA of the thing that you built. And languages that are dissimilar from your own are never really going to have the same kind of support that your own language does. And the sort of opposite of that mindset is this phrase. Has anyone ever seen this? This is maybe just a shitty software engineering buzz term. I hate this so fucking much. So this is short for internationalization. If you Google exactly this, you'll get a bunch of literature on technologies that internationalize software. And it's problematic on the level that just the idea of internationalization means you're taking something that was already fine and correct, and you're making it now international. It drives me crazy that people can't be bothered to just type that whole word out. They have to abbreviate it as this. But the correct mindset, I think, is that your system is just broken until, if it's a system that claims to be able to display text or process text, it's fundamentally broken until it can really do that, right? To be concrete, this is what encoding an Anglo-centric bias looks like in a code base. So this is a snippet taken from 3JS, which is a JavaScript library that does 3D graphics, in their font implementation. And briefly, this is basically looping over a bunch of characters. On the first sort of highlighted line, you see that if it encounters a new line character, that's the /n, it sets the x value, the horizontal value of the pen, to 0. So that means after every line, move the cursor back to the left. And after each character, it moves the x offset positive in x. So it moves forward in horizontal space. So code like this, or right-to-left language like Arabic or Hebrew, will never work. This will be wrong forever, right? This is an irredeemable code that actually needs to be thrown away. So don't do this. Right? This is my advice. The good news is you don't have to, right? A very nice Persian man, Baghdad, his name is Baghdad, Esfabad, I think I'm pronouncing his last name right, and a bunch of contributors, but it was mainly Baghdad, over about a decade have built a library called HarfBuzz. And HarfBuzz is a correct implementation of the shaping logic for every written language that a computer can represent, right? So your job as a tool maker is to know about this and use it, and not make excuses about not using it. The reason browsers are able to represent text correctly is because of this library. They all integrate it. So the tool that I showed you in the first slide was the creative coding tool that I built for myself. And I did the work of getting the text rendering system to support Arabic. So this is me printing out hello and printing out the word marhaba, which is hello in Arabic. It's more work than not doing it. But again, it's a question of a mindset. It's the part of the basic correctness of what I think being able to display text needs to be. So the flip side is if it's really like an overwhelming amount of work and you don't have the resources and you can't do it, then you can't, I think the only ethical thing to do then is rename whatever system you have to be what it actually is, right? Because if you tell me that your system can produce text and I give it text and it butchers a language that I'm a native speaker in, what you're telling me is that my language isn't text, right? So if you can't integrate harfbuzz, change your function names. Right?
Just for the sake of time, maybe we could do the last few points.
Yeah, I'm honest. I'll list it, yeah. Finally, for people who use tools, the simple advice is just don't assume that things work. Most people who make tools have not done what I've described. So I'll very quickly just go through some examples. I maintain a blog, if this is interesting to you, Nope Not Arabic, which is a record of butchered Arabic in the wild. That's a screenshot from the Colbert Report. Spoiler, for Marvel fans, this is from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The Arabic behind the character is not correct. This is an anti-Trump billboard in America. It's also butchered Arabic. This is Pokemon Go, back when that was popular, butchered Arabic. Someone got a tattoo of something that's just not Arabic, which makes me really sad. So if you're using tools, my advice is to just be suspicious of them and ask or hire a native speaker if you're working in a language that you're not familiar with. And finally, it's also, I think about the educational angle as a teacher because it's, I was in classes where, text processing was taught and none of this was sort of brought up. So being cognizant of this as an educator and bringing it to your students is also is your responsibility. And I'll skip the last couple slides just for time. But that's where I'm at. That's what I'm thinking. So thank you.
And our next panelist is Parrish Schlesinger.
Just moving the cable along. Oh, goodness gracious. It was working.
Fine.
Let's try again. Ta-da! Okay, wonderful. Happy to have that up. So let's fabulous. Okay, hi everybody. I am really honored to be here today, and I'm going to talk to you about the fatal error of overreacting to discrimination in software. So, along the general themes of this panel talking about the politics of not only deployment but also production, I want to talk about the ways that all of these systems are already present in open source programming. Well, programming generally, but open source, as the abstract for the whole presentation says, is a great opportunity to sort of reveal what's there. And so, generally speaking, politics in the production of code, both in the creation of code and the creation with code, is embroiled in late-stage neoliberal capitalism and white supremacist, ableist, heterosexist patriarchy, imperial open colonialism, all these things that we have been talking about periodically throughout the day. And that is super relevant, if not only just demonstrated by Ramsey, but for the work that I have done and for the work that I am in the process of doing right now. So to give you an introduction to who I am, a little bit about myself, I am a PhD student in the College of Computing at Georgia Tech. I'm getting my degree in something called human-centered computing, which often makes people scratch their heads, but I'm happy to explain it. We care a lot about the people side of computing. If you want more of an explanation, let me know. And I'm in the process of a number of studies researching how open source communities and code are tangled up with these larger societal structures of domination and power up on the screen in ways that impact equity, inclusion, and discrimination, and how code is produced and deployed. And so, while I'm still in the early stages of data collection for these studies, I can give you some of the preliminary themes that I think connect back to these overarching questions of ethics and politics in code production, and how open source reveals or changes what we can see. You know, I want to give you all of it, not just the negative or the positive. So there has been a talk of admiration for the open source ideal, but concerns about how it is applied in practice. Nonstop complaints from people across the technical capacity spectrum about how much of a pain in the butt developer setups are. There's a lot of desire for the processes and deployments to be more ethical, more politically aware, to be fairer, but people are really unsure of how to build better and fairer processes. There's been a persistent sense of technical inferiority, even from people who experience stereotypes that other people assume they are technically competent. There's a paradoxical relationship between the thoughts on meritocracy and the thoughts on how inclusion and discrimination practices work. In one interview I did, somebody of their own volition used the phrase systemic racism and then proceeded to say some things that were kind of shocking that they existed in the same brain, particularly from somebody who's so embroiled in this particular cultural space. And there's been a gender divide in perceptions on the processes of open source. Particularly, it sort of seems to be skewed to cis men versus everybody else. Shocking. And there's been a lot of talk about tokenism and being insincere, being exploitative of the diversity and inclusion processes. And while I would love to talk to you in depth about all of those things and the findings I'm currently developing, there's something else that I have to talk about first, something that we all have to talk about first, and that is, did it cut out?
I'll bring it back.
Oh, that's fun. Well, at least it's just more or less verbatim the text I'm saying to try and make it more accessible, so you are unlikely to be missing out on much. Well, should I or pause? Probably. I think that's the wise call.
Sorry, this is far more disruptive than I thought it was going to be.
That's okay. I mean, there's perfect. There is no conference, symposium, anything without technical problems.
Never happened.
Yeah, it's just not a reality. Is that any better? Nothing still. This is why I need to be This does not appear to be better. Sure, I will absolutely try a different adapter for this garbage anyway. Thank you all for being patient. Okay, super not my fault.
Definitely my fault. I was wrong.
No, I mean, it doesn't matter about fault. I just know I need a new computer, so I feel less bad. That's promising. There we go. Okay, I gotta restart it just so that I can see. Oh, now setup has changed. I'm sorry. Ta-da! Much better. Okay. Okay, getting back to what I was saying. Before we can talk in depth, and I think honestly and fairly about the politics that come with the production of code, we have to talk about the politics that come with talking about how code is political. And the best way that I can see to do this is to tell you about some of my lived experiences with investigating the politics in the production and deployment of code. And so I'm gonna do that by sharing with you the experiences I had on one fateful fall evening of last year, where I discovered 2 new things about myself and open source through the process of using a search engine. So the first thing I learned is that a number of years earlier, before this date of my discovery, The Sexism in Technology Wikipedia page had been edited to include an overview of harassment I experienced from parts of the open source community. And it did so in a way that talked about my intelligence and competencies in a super kind and thoughtful manner. No, not at all. So here's a quote. Later that year, a group calling themselves the Feminist Software Foundation released a language called C+ equality with syntax similar to C++. This quote continues, although announced as the type of feminist programming language that Schlesinger had in mind, the alleged purpose of the code was satirizing social justice and included numerous references to rape, boogeyman, and trigger warnings. So that was a fun thing to learn, had been attached to my name on the internet for an extended period of time. And sometime within that same hour, I discovered that just last year, 2018, in May, somebody had written a scholarly article about that same viral open source anti-feminist harassment phenomenon that I found myself at the center of. And especially since it was written from a feminist perspective, I would be lying if I said I wasn't kind of surprised that I hadn't been reached out to. And so one of the things that was said about me in this article is in expanding their discourse, there being that Feminist Software Foundation harassment group and others who joined in on with them, beyond themselves and into the voice of another, the authors attempt to invalidate the actual voice of Schlesinger. So the background on this is that as a senior in college, I posted a blog post to Haystack because I wanted to explore the idea of a feminist programming language. Baby idea. Like, I thought it was really exciting and interesting. There was a lot of potential, and I was asking for insight. Lo and behold, 3 months later, all hell broke loose. And so I'm gonna be honest with you. This slide right here is what my presentation looked like last night at 10 p.m. And the reason why is a little bit complicated, but I want to unpack it with you because I had to coerce myself into even opening up my presentation software to start this talk. And the thing is that this is a talk I haven't had the space to give before, both literally in a space like this, but also like mentally within myself. But it's a story that I know I need to share and I need to talk about, especially in this political code process, talking about it, et cetera. And so I still have a lot more that I need to do to unpack what happened on a personal level, on a deployment level, political, technical, production. But I want to give you a little bit more detail about how and why I got stuck last night with nothing to share, even though I knew I was going to be talking about this for like a month. So here is a very tiny screenshot of my desktop timestamped last night at 11:14 p.m. I am sorry that the Finder window is so small. I'm just trying to protect a bit of my privacy about my file hierarchy. So nonetheless, in this Finder window that is more than 6 layers deep into my computer's file system is a folder titled Virality in Responses. And I have been avoiding opening it in preparation for this talk for weeks. In this folder, I saved every item, every piece of evidence, everything that I could find that anyone ever said about me during this stretch of time that I could. I remember waking up to an email like halfway through or the beginning of my final senior undergrad semester that was like, our website normally, talking about Haystack, our website normally gets 600 visitors a day. Your webpage your link has gotten more than 30,000 visitors in the last hour. Heads up. I mean, and they were really supportive. It's jarring. And so I was on high alert. I was super careful to get evidence in case something bad happened to me or my family or my friends. I also had to take precautions to archive all the evidence of harm and harassment that would disappear from web servers because of ephemerality features of some particularly infamous websites. And that meant that I had to keep myself stuck in this state of direct personal, physical, and intellectual attack for an extended period of time. There are nearly 100 items in this folder, which doesn't even speak to the size or volume of content in those items. But to give you a sense of what it looks like, here's a cartoon somebody drew of me. And I'll say that collecting these documents has been and was all-consuming. Experiencing this whole ordeal was all-consuming. I remember my advisor, one of my advisors in undergrad, Alex Uhas, said to me, "Are you okay? You look really stressed out." I'm like, "I'm not stressed. It's totally fine. It's normal. I'm doing fine." And I had no other choice but to reinforce that to myself. But clearly, I mean, it's years later now. Maybe not super fine. I was just so worried about being doxxed. I was worried about what was going to happen to my name and if I was going to be employable. I was worried about my safety, my family's safety. And all of this is because of a blog post I wrote asking for feedback on a research question. So suddenly, even asking questions and exploring my ideas, exploring the politics and ethics built into the technical infrastructure of code itself wasn't safe. There I was, asking these questions about the politics and power of the programming medium itself, and a group of other programmers illustrated just how easy politics can be found in the medium itself, in the distribution and production of software, using that to mock me, harass me, and shut my whole idea down before I even got started. And that doesn't even begin to touch on the oppressive remarks veering quickly into anti-Semitic and sexist territory. The blog that this comic comes from is a whole other mess unto itself. The short version is the author of this blog and this illustration believes in free speech, and the fact that none of the people he has called out on their ideological fallacies have fought back and reached out to him to defend their name on his website is proof positive that he is right. So there you go. I didn't extend extra labor and time and safety, and so I'm obviously an idiot. Anyways, that's an interesting little internet microcosm in and of itself, but it seems to me that in open source, any type of reaction is an overreaction. And as a result, the truth is I've been barely able to react to it at all. People ask me still, how's that project going? Are you working on it? Where's it at? And there's not a lot to say to that. I mean, here's how I see it now. My autonomic nervous system kicked in. I went past fight or flight into this type of paralysis, you know, like if a tiger is attacking you and your body anticipates you're going to be in so much pain that you just freeze. And so I responded to this enormous threat, perceived or otherwise, in a way that Stephen Porges' research on polyvagal theory outlines. I froze. And so in this talk, at the very beginning, I had this fantastical, wonderful idea that maybe I'd be able to look at some of the features of the documents in that virality and responses folder and talk about them and share how they validate the idea while trying to invalidate it. But also, I mean, I couldn't agree more with some of the things Ramsey said about how you just can't fix some of the programming language stuff. But there was never a real chance for me to explore any of this because I had to just steal myself away. And so, like, the truth is that I still have a lot to process here on my own, and I need to actually react, which would allow me to finally overreact, because I can tell you that I'm really fucking angry about all of this. But I have a hard time sitting with that anger because it's not safe. And these overreactions that I'm having, that other people have, really need to be tied to the technologies and communities that produce, deploy, and live with all these code artifacts if there's an intention and a desire to have some social impact and social change with the research that happens. But it isn't safe to critically and openly react to the politics of production and technical tools. I mean, especially if you exist outside of the complex of that white and male identity complex. You know, you'd think the world was ending if anyone else ever had an opinion online, which is incredibly ironic since open source is produced with the politics of openness in the code and the infrastructure and the interface and the deployment. Here I am trying to think openly, sharing preliminary research thoughts on an open blog platform, and a community built on producing with this politics of openness has hurled fire at my face for doing so. So for now, I am working on overreacting and bringing this piece types of reaction and overreaction and whether it's even safe to do this type of work into this conversation about the politics of code. And while I'd like to share more about the research that I'm in the process of doing right now and the things I'm developing there, and it is beautifully ironic and serendipitous to me that by accident, my dissertation / proposal research has brought me back to open source in a way that I had never intended to reassess. But for now, I'm just gonna have to keep working on the overreacting thing. And so I can keep thinking and practicing and working with the difference between intent and impact and how I can bring all that into my research moving forward. So to help reset my and potentially your autonomic nervous system and to get out of a threat response, here's a really cute picture of my new puppy. Yay! So thank you all so much for your time. I'm really excited to chat about this.
Thank you, Ari. Next panelist is Alejandro Tamayo.
Do you need a ensemble? Don't use mine, obviously.
USDC?
No, he's got the same as me.
That's right.
That should be the right one.
Okay.
You're all set.
Good. Thank you very much, David, for the invitation, and thank you very much to all of you for being here. My presentation, part of my presentation is silent because part of my research has to do with the language of materials and forms. So part of this presentation is a series of photographs that I've been taking for the last 5 years. Since I moved to live in Hamilton. And this research is also, it was part of my practice-based PhD research in a sculpture and installation at York University, where I had the opportunity to work with Mark Rue, who is a musician, a performer, and a sound artist. And during this process, I began to think about time as an important component of sculpture. So before talking more about this, I'm gonna present a series of photographs without talking about them, and then I will give some speculative notions about time, which is basically my current exploration. So then it goes on a loop. So what I want to talk about is not about the images themselves or the technology that is used for projecting them or the technology that is used for taking the photograph, but about the moment of encountering them. So when David invited me to participate in this panel, I was thinking about how I can contribute with my current practice and my current research. So I thought that what I could say about this process is that they are kind of gift offered by the territory. So when I was thinking about open source, I think that open source has this ideal of being a gift that everyone can use in case they need to use it. So that was my kind of connection with the images. But I wanted to reflect and try to talk about the temporality of the gift from, let's say, kind of a philosophical perspective, and we want perhaps a metaphysical perspective. Because I think it's very hard to talk about a language that happens in time and is based on material forms, colors, actions, and then try to translate this language into the language that I'm speaking, which is linear, which is created one word after the other, where meaning is created as the language unfolds in time. So that was a difficulty, and it still is a difficulty, but I think that's the challenge of working with materials and getting in contact with them. So I wanted to approach this language as a gift, and in order to tune yourself with this language, that is a silent language. The only, what we need is to tune our mind for silence. And how I do that is just by going out on a random walk. And the activity of walking can also take on a kind of a resistance kind of practice, because when I'm walking, I'm not producing, I'm not making a sculpture, which is the traditional way of, when you study a sculpture, you need to make an object. And then you start to think about the commodity, you start to think about ownership, you start to think about all the same kind of logic that exists in the system that we are reflecting about. So when I go out for a walk and I try to silence my mind, and also thinking about, in the context of technology, thinking about the technologies of the self by Michel Foucault. So my approach to technology is it's becoming less and less connected with the machines, but perhaps trying to create a hijacking the machine of capitalism by perhaps avoiding the need or the temptation to produce objects, and just looking at what it's around in the environment, produced by, not by artists, not produced by sculptors, but my interest is trying to get into this material, ephemeral language that is happening, and try to find perhaps myself out in the territory. This is not a new practice. This is a practice that I can go back to the data practices at the beginning of the 19th century. But it can also be connected with the practice of surrealism, and is documented in some books. For example, Nadia from André Breton, in which he starts this book by asking the question of, who am I? And he goes to random walks in Paris. And it's not clear for the reader if the person is actually looking for someone or if he's being hunted by Paris itself. Do I have like 3 more minutes, 4 more minutes? How long do I have?
we should move on soon.
Okay. So the last thing I would like to introduce, and I don't have enough time to unpack, is the notion of affect that I think it's a way of entering into this language. Affect has been theorized by Brian Masumi in many different books, but what I find interesting is his latest book, The Politic of Affect, where he gives an understanding, or he explains the temporality of affect, and he connects affect with the notion of the event. The notion of the event is important for Masumi because it's situated in the middle. An event is an action in the territory upon the human body. And by thinking through affect, Brian Masumi is trying to cut the binary division between objects and subjects, which is part of the binary where I would say is one of the biggest binaries in which we currently are. There is a particular orientation towards the future in the notion of the event. For Masumi, the affect and event is an entering into the future, into the present, rather than perpetuating the logic of the past. So by connecting with this notion, I think that this also helps to think about different notions of being in the world where we are not possessing, where we are not producing more objects, but we are looking around into the environment, looking at what we have. And the final element that I just want to bring is the notion of a signifying semiotics, which were introduced by the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari. And this notion of a signifying semiotics are based on affect, which operate not on the basis of signs that operate not on the basis of meaning and signification, but operate directly on the body at speeds that are way higher than the process of creating meaning in the way that I'm talking. And this notion of signifying semiotics has been also theorized as a way to try to understand the way capitalism works. Just to conclude, I would like to say that just a speculation about what art can be, if art is a particular orientation towards the real, then this orientation has to do with time. Art has to do with the sense of an opening, of being open to other temporalities. And in thinking about open source, I will finish by a quote from Brian Masumi, who says that to affect and to be affected is to be open to the world.
Thank you, Alejandro. So we have one more panelist, Allison, Parrish.
How are we doing on time?
Well, it's a bit tight.
Can you be more specific?
I think what we should do is give your 10-minute presentation. We'll take a question or two, and then if people have other questions, people are around. They're still around. So we're okay.
There was supposed to be 10 minutes.
Yes.
Oh, no, saying is 20. Okay. That's my thing.
That was also my understanding. Okay, well.
That is like a lot. I'm very sorry.
Well, let's see what can be done here. I will probably skip the slide with the sound in it, given where we are. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Allison Parrish. I'm a poet and a computer programmer. I'm an assistant arts professor at New York University's Interactive Telecommunications program, where I teach about computer-generated poetry, and that's the bulk of my practice, is thinking about poetry as a kind of artifact that you can create with computer programs. My practice is very interdisciplinary, and so I always feel like I'm running the risk of looking foolish in front of all the disciplines that I sort of half-assedly participate in. And this presentation in particular, like I'm sort of like hitting above my pay grade in terms of the philosophical points that I want to make. There's no chance that anyone has keeping up to date with current machine learning research. It just moves way too fast for anybody to actually know anything about it, especially people who only have time to sort of pay attention to it. But my practice involves machine learning. A lot of the stuff that I do starts off with machine learning as the basis. I'm not going to have time to like talk about this in particular, but recently I've been working on machine learning-based models of phonetics in English language in order to turn words into vector representations, which allows me to do poetic compositions that look like this. This is from a book of mine that was published last year called Articulations. These are lines of poetry from a very large poetry corpus that are arranged by phonetic similarity, just like sorted and putting like one line of poetry next to another line of poetry based on how similar they sound to each other. This is accomplished with a kind of dimensionality reduction on a matrix of hand-engineered features on phonetic transcriptions of these words. So that's like an introduction to my work in 30 seconds. But what I actually want to talk about in terms of this panel is language models. Language models of poetry in particular, but just like language models in general and the place that they have in society right now. So a language model, well, I have an illustration here. Basically, the purpose of a language model, it's a machine learning thing, which basically the purpose of a language model is to take some text in and then assign a probability to that text based on how likely it is that text belongs to a particular language or corpus. So in this example, in this fictional language model that I've invented, you pass in the phrase, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. The language model says 95% chance that's English, let's say. But if you pass in the phrase, philosopher parted, brawling patchwork, brazen Peter comrade, shadowy treadmill, it says, I don't really know about that. That's like 15% probability. Usually, they're trained on an existing corpus. You have a language model of English, you have a language model of Shakespeare, you have a language model of Wikipedia. They're used in the processes of text categorization. So if I have one model for messages that are spam for my email folder and one model that is for messages that are not spam, you can get the probability score for both of those models to determine whether an incoming message is spam or not. They're also used in speech recognition systems. So the speech comes into the system and it could be maybe labeled in one of two ways. If I say recognize speech, the computer could interpret that as rec a nice beach, or it could interpret as recognize speech. A language model helps disambiguate the two by saying, well, there's a high probability that recognize speech is a phrase in English, but a very low probability that rec a nice beach is a phrase in English. So it helps make those decisions in that process. There are different kinds of language models. The sort of traditional standard is something called an n-gram language model, where you score either the probability of individual words or the probability of pairs of words or the probability of triplets of words and so forth. And those have particular properties, but more recent work in language models have relied or have used neural networks, which usually can work on a basically limitless window of text. So it bases its probabilities not on just like one or two words in sequence, but like on the entire sequence of words. To generate text with a language model, it looks sort of like this. You basically ask, what is the probability, or you say, start with this beginning phrase, it was the best of times, it was the worst at, and then say, give me a probability for every word in English. What is the probability that that word will follow in that phrase? And these are like completely made up. They're not actually made up probabilities. These are unigram probabilities of these words in a particular corpus. But you basically get a score out that says the probability of any word occurring after these other words corresponds to these values, and then you select the one that has the highest probability, or you select based on the probabilities of those words. So using this, you can chain together predictions. If it's based on an n-gram model, that's called a Markov chain. But basically all text generation procedures based on a language model follow the same principle. Predict the next word, add that to the text, predict the next word after that, and so forth. Chain those predictions together to make a text. Now, the thing that's been in the news, the language model that's been in the news lately is OpenAI's GPT-2, which is a large transformer-based language model with 1.5 billion parameters trained on a data set of 8 million web pages. GPT-2 is trained with a simple objective: predict the next word, given all of the previous words within some text. The thing that sort of made news about this is that these researchers from OpenAI decided not to release the model to the public because they thought it was too dangerous, because you could use it to produce fake content very easily. And there's been a lot of back and forth in the machine learning crowd about whether this is actually valid. Personally, I think we already have many machines in the world for generating fake content, and they're called human beings, and I don't really see this lowering the cost of producing fake content. But from my perspective as a poet, the thing that I think about a lot is can a language model produce poetry? And this is some example output from a GPT-2 model that was sort of fine-tuned by an individual named Ogborn. I don't know much about this person other than they're well-known in machine learning and arts crowds. This was actually trained on the Project Gutenberg corpus of poetry that I made, that I've been using in my own research, which is kind of a coincidence. But you can see that these are actually pretty good, and these are kind of typical of the quality of GPT-2. Because it's such a large language model, it can incorporate a lot of context and therefore create, when it's generating text, it can create really long distance dependencies between parts of the text and appear to create text with coherence from beginning to end, which is very different from a language model based on bigrams or trigrams where the possible context is very, very narrow. But the thing that happens with this, if you read Ogborn's blog post, it's very, very measured about the possibilities of this model. But the reactions to it tend to be things like this. If you're a poet, this should chill you to the marrow of your bones, because it's clearly better than some of the human poetry you've read. This is from a blog post that was it was titled "On the Significance of Ogborn's Poem Generator," and that's kind of the way that these discussions always go. There's some big new language model, and then you have things like this. So the one on the left is actually about GPT-2 from The Guardian, in that the classic Guardian opinion piece style. The one on the right is actually from a completely different poetry generator from 5 years ago. Immediately the issue, as soon as you have the computer program produced this artistic artifact, the discussion immediately becomes robots are going to destroy us. There's not even a second of a gap. It's oh, this poem was written by a computer. Oh my God, robots are going to destroy us. That's the only headline it's possible to write about this work, apparently. What I think about this is that this attitude towards text generated by automated procedures has a really, really long history. And one of those that I want to talk about has to do with the Fox sisters, who originated American spiritualism in 1948, claimed to contact spirits by knocking on furniture. So you would ask a question, say is there a spirit in the room? 2 knocks for yes, 1 knock for no. I don't know how you get 1 knock in that case. I guess the spirit doesn't want to talk. Or you could ask questions to the spirits after you've acknowledged their presence. What was interesting to me in researching this is that they actually called this typology, from the same root of typing. This is before the invention, or basically contemporaneous with the invention of the typewriter. So table rappers called themselves typologists, using the same Greek root that we now have for typewriter or typing, and claimed to the original or the first metaphors for this were saying that the Fox sisters were basically a telegraph to the spirit world, right? So these technologies are intimately linked with each other. But relevant to my discussion is that people then claim to receive books of poems through table rapping. You would say, I'm gonna keep knock when I reach the letter that you want to come next in the text, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then that would be how you would transcribe messages from the spirit world. And entire books that were attributed to Edgar Allan Poe or to Oscar Wilde were produced with this technique, up to and including, this is one of my favorite things that I've learned about recently, this is an advertisement for a book written by a chair from 1853, Juanita, novel by a chair, followed by a proverb and some select pieces of the same author. The literary productions of the chair are merely the preface of a mystic book which will unroll page by page before the dazzled eyes of the believers. Which to me, like this rhetoric surrounding this book, this novel produced by a chair, is so very close to like this right here, even though it's 170 years later, it's exactly the same rhetoric, right? And sort of exactly the same source, like attributing to some mechanical process, or in the case of table wrapping, some process that's produced by like everyone in the room agreeing that this thing is actually happening, being attributed to this inanimate object, and then that being like the that being this thing that is then going to take over the labor of producing these artistic artifacts, right? That's 10 minutes. I don't know what else to say. Maybe I should just end on the punchline of the chair. One thing that I did want to touch on also is that poets have also been using language models, like poets, creative writers have been using language models for a long time to produce poetry, using like not exactly the same technology as GPT-2, but Markov chains, other kinds of text generation based on that technique. They're usually used for satirical purposes. So this is Arrowhead Recruiter, which is a Twitter bot that his language model based on half drug reports from Arrowhead, the drug website, and half recruiter emails for tech companies. So you get great things like, hi Bob, are you open to jumping on an exponential trip to Happyville? Which I think is great. The poet Charles Hartman used language models in his poetry. This is one of the best applications of Markov chains in a literary context. This is from his long-form poem, Monologues of Soul and Body. And then actually, this is Tristan Tzara's To Make a Dadaist Poem, famous procedure in the French avant-garde, the early 20th century, in which Tristan Tzara, the poet, says, here's how you make a poem. Take a newspaper, cut each word up, and put those words into a hat, shake gently, draw them out one by one, and then the poem will resemble you, or the poem will suit you, is kind of more what that means, I think. And here you are, an infinitely original writer endowed with sensibility that is charming and beyond the understanding of the vulgar. I think about this a lot. It's sort of a touchstone in many avant-garde writing practices. I thought it was just like the origin of cut-up writing techniques. But it's also, if you look at it, it is a language model. This is a unigram language model. It's basically like almost the same thing as GPT-2, except it's based on a window of exactly one word instead of a window of potentially infinite words. And this is the output of this. And you can see, like, it looks like, well, this is an English translation of what was produced in French, but you can see that it exhibits some of these characteristics of language that are also present in the output of GPT-2. To me, from a technical standpoint, this is exactly the same thing. From a formal standpoint, it's doing almost exactly the same thing. I'm trying to figure out what else I want to say. Language models, however, are not equipped to deal with the great variety of the way that language manifests itself in creative practices. You have Ilya Zdanovich, a Russian futurist, practicing Zaum. Typographical experiments, but also experiments in making up new words for expressive purposes. This is Nobresse Philip Zong, in which typography and word fragments are put together in order to create a particular emotional feeling. This is Lavender Cotton from Louis Zukowski's 80 Flowers, which is a poem, like a beautiful, beautiful book of poems, but that don't correspond to well-known English syntax. Charles Bernstein will have to skip. And this is a textual amulet from 7th century Chinese Buddhist practice, where these are among different spells, like you can write these characters on a piece of paper, and the way that you make this character have an effect in the world, it's an anti-envenomation amulet what you do is you write it in a particular color of ink on a sheet of paper, and then you eat the paper. And I bring these up as examples of like language models, as they're currently constituted, cannot cope with any of these examples. Like there is no language model that can account for the effect that text has when you eat it, right? That's just not part of the realm of language models in general. So the implications of this, I have a whole bunch of quotes up here from theorists and poets, but what I'm trying to get at is that language models are sort of set up as this like, we can have an infinite understanding of language. Like as soon as the language model gets good enough, we're going to get to the point where all language can be predicted, right? That's the underlying sort of like Kurzweilian accelerationist logic behind the language model. And that's behind OpenAI's logic in not releasing the model. They're like, this is so good, no one will be able to tell the difference. And that's also the logic between somebody like Mark Zuckerberg saying like, we can fix abuse on our platform, we can fix hate speech, we just need to rely on artificial intelligence, because they think as soon as the language model gets good enough, then we'll be able to solve that problem. But these poets are showing us that like language that doesn't fit into language models, that's actually the default. Like it's not, that's what it is possible to do with language. That's what poets have been doing since the beginning of time, right? That is actually the point of poetry. And if poets can do it, then people who are making hate speech can do it too, right? Doing violence with language, violence isn't something that inheres in the text, violence is something that you do with language, right? And part of the reason that I make poetry with machine learning is to show where those boundaries break and to show how language models are not sufficient for accounting for the variety of stuff in English. So I'll close with these two quotes. To arrest once and for all the meaning of words, this is what terror wants, says Leotard. And then Zadanovich himself says, language is not a lie, it's not a mirror, it's not a phantom without force, it is complete power. Language is not a representation, language is a thing that happens in the world. We have to treat it like that.